Can you hear me? No? Okay. Always have to turn it up for me. My voice is kind of quiet. Okay, so we'll go back to our study on spiritual discernment. And, of course, the first time we tried to define what it is and talk a little bit about just what it is. We came up with a definition the first study, and then we began to look at some of the reasons why we need this discernment last week. And went over the first two, which are, first of all, it's a marker of spiritual maturity, spiritual discernment. It's a marker of maturity, and they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. There's no such thing as spiritual maturity without discernment or discernment without spiritual maturity. They always go together. And then the second reason was we have a real enemy who is out to do us harm, and so we need to have discernment for that. And the third reason, we'll talk about just the third reason tonight, which is the prevalence of false teachers. And we're going to just stop at about halftime tonight and let Chris come and tell us a little bit about the conference that he just came back from, because there's a lot of significant things that happened there. And so we'll find out what really happened instead of what Twitter says. So the prevalence of false teachers. Now, before we get into this much, I want to make sure we don't understand. I'm going to make this point in a bigger way later on in the study. But discernment is right. It's the ability to tell the difference between things that look very similar. It's to discern what makes these two things different. And so, but most people have this idea of discernment is just basically trying to figure out what's bad. What's bad teaching? What's wrong teaching? What's false teaching? But it's just as important to be able to tell what is good. We have to be able to tell what is bad and what is good. What is wrong, what is right. What is dark, what is light. Because you can have people who know that so-and-so is a false teacher, but they can't tell that this other guy over here is a very good teacher. So discernment has to go both ways. We're going to talk just about false teachers tonight, but I just want to make sure that we understand that it's not just about finding out what's wrong, but tonight it'll be about finding out what's wrong. God warns us about false teachers throughout the Bible. 1 John 4:1, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. So don't believe every spirit. In the original language, it's probably closer to stop believing every spirit. Stop it, he's saying. You guys are just believing anything and anybody who acts like they know what they're talking about. You're believing anything they have to say, so stop it. So John is writing to people who are already believing things that they should not believe. They're already kind of giving in to false things. So they're weak in their discernment of true versus false. They're hearing false things and embracing them. So these people and us, we need to be warned about the prevalence of false teaching. There's more of it than we may realize. And sadly, the Bereans are not the norm. People who examine everything and compare it to what the Scripture says is not the normal people. So discerning people will examine what's being said. You listen to the words being spoken, and then just paying attention to what's being said, and then contemplating, the implication of those words, and double checking and checking with the Bible if necessary to make sure that it doesn't say something completely different than what's being said. So it's important to. 2 Peter, we hear about false teaching again. So false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. So it's a pretty detailed description of some of the ways that the false teaching will affect people. There were false prophets. There are false teachers. There will continue to be false teachers. They're all counterfeits, right? They arrived on the scene very early in church history. Not long after Paul started preaching the gospel, they followed him everywhere he went, preaching other gospels and other Jesuses. So they secretly, that's a powerful word there, they secretly bring in destructive heresies into the church. And they have about them some sensuality, he describes here. They exploit people through their own greed, and I would say through people's greed a lot as well, and they use smooth words. They're very good at what they do. They secretly bring in false teachings, false heresies, teaching that are really designed to separate people from God rather than teach about God. In order to do a couple things, right? To keep any unbelievers who happen to come into the church from becoming believers. So you have a church that's preaching false gospel, nobody's going to go to that church and become a Christian. And for making the Christians who are at that place less effective, less good at doing what they're supposed to do as Christians. And so sneakiness and subtlety come to mind when you think about them, right? They bring in ideas that are almost the truth. They have truth-adjacent ideas. It's like this is where the words of Spurgeon come to mind again, where he said, discernment is not necessarily telling the difference between true and false, but telling the difference between true and almost true. And so they can, with subtlety and sneakiness, they can come in, and they learn to tweak things just enough in the way they word them to keep sounding sound, but taking the life out of the words, right? They mix the truth with a little bit of sensuality and a little bit of greed, and next thing you know, people are blatantly sinning and believing they're holy. And they're believing they somehow have the right to have the things that they naturally desire. And he says false teachers will even deny the Lord that bought them. There are people who claim to be preachers of the gospel that we know are not, right? They're in pulpits all over the world. And they may be willing to give the Lord some minor compliment or some minor honor, like he's a good teacher, things like this. But we have seen the Lord, his divinity denied in many cases. But a sneaky thing about the false teachers is they don't look like false teachers. They look just like us. They look just like sheep. The Lord said, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. They look like sheep. They seem like sheep in their mannerisms. The words they use are sheep words. They speak Christianese without even having a demonic accent. They can speak the language we speak, and they learn to use it and manipulate it. But the good news for us in this is that the gospel is actually very simple. It's not tricky. The gospel is not hard to understand. Anybody can understand it. There are basically two ways of life, right? There's the easy way of life where you do whatever you want. You live the selfish life. It says it's the big road that's full of people, it's crowded, and it's easy to get on that road. In fact, you're born on that road, right? And so it's a pretty easy life there, the broad way. And the other way is the narrow way of denying yourself for the sake of the Lord. And so the gospel is very simple, and so it's hard to deceive true believers. That one passage where the Lord talks about the time being shortened for the sake of the elect, that even in that time, they almost deceive the elect, but not quite, right? But one reason so many don't follow that narrow road is because they're deceived by the false teaching, and they're presented with ideas that there's another way to get fulfillment in life. Because everybody wants to be fulfilled. Everybody wants some sort of happiness. Everybody is dreaming of something. And so they're trapped, deceived into thinking there's another way to get that satisfaction, that fulfillment that the Lord provides. It appeals to something inside of the hearers, right? It appeals to some fleshly, visceral thing inside, and it has a certain way of speaking to the untransformed parts of the heart. Like, for example, one of the most famous false teaching, of course, the prosperity gospel. It gives you the permission to be greedy. It gives you the permission to, or even the right to desire the things that are not right for you to desire. So generally speaking, the appeal of false teaching is almost always earthbound things. It appeals to something here that can make your life here better, rather than something in eternity. But they can get tricky and sneaky because there are many cults, right, that teach their people to live very sacrificial lives. And almost always that sacrifice that they live benefits the leaders in some way. And so it's trickier than just, it's not just an appeal to the flesh and what the flesh wants. It can appeal to some noble sentiment as well. But these are wolves. Jesus calls them ravenous wolves, and Paul calls them fierce wolves. And they come off as friendly messengers with pleasant ideas, but a bad tree will always have bad fruit. So this is a way to discern who they are. And wrong teaching always produces wrong behavior, eventually. False teaching also creates wrong motives, and it even creates wrong kinds of hopes, right? It creates those temporal hopes. So another reason people don't follow that narrow road is because they deceive themselves. Sometimes, I remember in college, one of the first books I read was called a short story called Young Goodman Brown. You guys ever heard of it? But in that short story, this young Goodman Brown, his wife is so righteous and so perfect. His idea is, if I can just cling to her, I'll ride her to heaven. I'll ride her skirts to heaven, right? She's going to heaven for sure, so if I just stick with her, I'll go to heaven. But in the middle of the story, he finds out she's actually a witch. So it's like people believe that being associated with Christians, maybe you'll get to heaven. And so you have the people who Jesus talks about saying, but we did this in your name, we did that in your name, we went to church, we hung around with all these people. And he'll say to them, I never knew you. So this false teaching creates a false kind of hope. And the difference between Jesus' teaching and false teaching is interesting in the Bible. It was kind of obvious to some people. They compared Jesus' teaching to the teaching of the scribes, and they said, wow, this is different. This guy is different from them. They would refer to some rabbi from 100 years ago who said this, and they would rest in that kind of authority. But Jesus spoke in his own authority, which resounded in the people's hearts in a different way. They could just speak about regulations and laws, but Jesus spoke with his own authority. And even one day, the chief priests and the Pharisees decided to arrest him while he was teaching in the temple. And they even sent some soldiers there to get him, some policemen, temple police, to go arrest him. And what they said, they came back without him, and why didn't you get him? Their saying was, well, nobody ever spoke like this man. So we know that his teaching is different. And so they could tell not only that the teaching of the scribes was not so good, but that Jesus' preaching was very good. So that's a significant difference that we'll have to learn as we go on here. Now, a lot of the talk in the New Testament about false teachers is around the idea of elders having to protect the sheep from false teachers. We see here Paul talking to the Ephesian elders, and he says, pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things, to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease, night or day, to admonish everyone with tears. So elders are even here warned to watch out for themselves first, and second, to watch over the flock. It's like the idea when you're in a plane, right, and the oxygen mask comes down. They say, put on your own first, then you'll be able to put on somebody else's. It's the same kind of an idea. The elders need to take care of their own souls, because without healthy elders, how can the church grow in a positive, healthy way? It's the first duty because all the other duties depend on that. And I think the same idea applies to every kind of leadership in the church or in the home, right? If you have somebody who you are shepherding, somebody who you're taking care of, somebody who you are discipling, children you're raising, then you are First of all, in order to take care of them, you take care of your own spiritual condition. Get yourself right with God first, and then you'll be able to take care of them. Guard over yourself, that you can guard over them. You're like, men, you want to guard over your families, guard over your own spiritual life first, and then you'll see clear how to take care of your family. Moms and dads, make sure your lives are in good shape so that you are able then to take care of your kids. That's a prerequisite to taking care of them. So leaders, in any way, are really to make it their life's mission to promote the spiritual welfare of the people they lead. That's true of leaders at every level. I like how Paul admonishes the elders in verse 31. He says, "Be on the alert, remembering that night and day for a period of 3 years I did not cease to admonish each one of you with tears." I love the pastoral heart of Paul. It's so profound how he cares for the people that God has given him to take care of. And I pray that each one of us will have some small amount of that as we take care of each other to some degree. Remembering that each one of us was purchased with the blood of Jesus Christ, and so we need to value each other in that way. We see again the care and concern of Paul over the souls he's watching in 2 Corinthians, where he says, "I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Do bear with me, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one who we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with that readily enough. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way, we have made this plain to you in all things." So Paul had compared the church to a virgin that he wants to present to Christ as a bride. And so he was concerned about how easy they were to deceive. The false teachers were coming into the Corinthian church and leading them astray, and it reminded him of how Eve was deceived. "I'm afraid the same thing's happening to you," he said. You guys are being deceived by men. He calls them super apostles. There's probably sarcasm in there, right? Super apostles. But they're under the influence of Satan, right? It's the same old story repeating itself, Paul said. It's an old story, right? If someone comes to you proclaiming a different Jesus than the one that we proclaimed, you're eager to accept it. You're even ready to embrace a completely different gospel. So how frustrating this was for Paul in his day, and is for us in our day, right? To see the some people we take care of, see them drift away in this way, and to fall under the sway of persuasive arts of false teachers. And so he had good reason to suspect, and we have reason to suspect, that the enemy will try to do this to everybody here. He'll try to lure you away with something. He'll find something in you that he can latch onto and try to use in this way. So as long as we're on this earth, there's always going to be false apostles, false prophets, false teachers. They've been here since the beginning, and but they're deceivers. They pretend they have a commission from God, but they don't. But they look just like us, so it's hard to tell sometimes. One last passage here that describes them. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. That's a hard, they look so real. They look so much like the real thing. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it's not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds. So they are here in our context, in our world, in our city, I'm sure. They're deceitful workers. They're kind of crafty. They're fraudulent. They're hypocritical. But they may not even know these things about themselves. So we have a hard time recognizing them sometimes, and they have a hard time recognizing themselves for what they are. And so we'll stop there. I don't want to spend too much time on this one because we want to hear from Chris tonight. about what happened at this conference. Twitter is saying so many terrible things, but...
All right, I'm going to use this microphone so that they can catch me on the live stream. Otherwise, they won't have a clue what I'm saying. They may not anyway, but that's okay. So last week, week before last, I was on vacation. Last week, I was also gone. But last week, I was gone because I went to attend the Southern Baptist Convention in Indianapolis. It's in a different city every year, and Southern Baptist churches send what are called messengers, representatives of the churches, and each year I go as a representative of our church, as a messenger, and we go and we attend the convention for 2 days. There are other events that happen around it, but the convention itself lasts for 2 days. We attend. There are various things voted upon, discussed, debated. People are elected to positions within the convention that will last for the following year, and so all sorts of things happen. And so that's where I was. And I thought it would be helpful if I just took a few minutes tonight to kind of let you know what went on and why does it matter? Why do I bother? Why does the church set aside some money so that I can get a plane and a hotel and go up there and spend a couple of days every year? Why does it matter? Why is it important? And the first thing that I really feel like almost every time I talk about this that I need to do is to maybe tell you what the Southern Baptist Convention is. Because it won't matter to you at all what's going on or why I go there if you don't sort of have an idea of what it is. So just by a show of hands, how many of you grew up, or prior to coming to this church, you had been a member of and a part of Southern Baptist churches? So quite a few of you, several of you. But quite a few of you didn't raise your hand as well. So the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the things that's really helpful is to compare it to other denominations. So, for instance, you think of the United Methodist Church or the Presbyterian Church in America or the Roman Catholic Church. All of those I'm emphasizing the word church in the name of all of those groups. Whereas when you talk about the Southern Baptist Convention, we don't hear the word church in it. And that's because the Southern Baptist Convention is not a large church or a large authority structure that oversees a lot of individual churches. All of the denominations that I just named have a structure in which, yes, you have a local church, but above that local church you have other people in authority who have some say. It varies from denomination to denomination. They have some sort of say about what goes on in that particular local church. So when you look at these denominations, why do they have church in their name? It's because in a very real sense, they do view the entire denomination as a church with a leadership structure that filters on down all the way to the bottom. That's not the case for Baptist churches at all, and not for the Southern Baptist Convention. Because one of the most important things, one of the things that makes a Baptist church, not the only thing, but one of the things, is a belief in something called the autonomy of the local church. And that means that each local church has self-rule, has autonomy. So that there's no one outside of our church who can tell us what we need to do. There's no bishop or there's no council of elders outside of our church that can decide how we spend our money or who we hire on staff or any sort of thing for us. Every Baptist church is autonomous and has self-rule. And that's true for Southern Baptist churches as well, which means that the Southern Baptist Convention does not have authority over Covenant Baptist Church or any other church. There's no authority structure there by which they can tell us what to do in any sort of capacity. So then what is it? If it's not an authority structure, right? If we're not meeting there to make decisions that will guide us in what we do and tell us what to do, then what are we doing when we gather? What is it? Well, probably the key term there is cooperation. That the Southern Baptist Convention is a group of churches cooperating together to accomplish some common goals. And it's a voluntary cooperation. Any church at any time can say, I don't want to be a part of that anymore, and remove themselves from it. That's the way that it works. It's a voluntary cooperation. So we send money, we send sometimes other resources, and those resources are pulled together to do things that we alone as a church would not be able to accomplish. Now, there's a lot of things that the Southern Baptist Convention does, but the main things that are funded through our cooperative effort are missionaries. So we have the North American Mission Board, and that's pretty self-explanatory. It's for missions in North America. And then we have the International Mission Board, and that's everywhere else. Missionaries that go everywhere else. The Southern Baptist Convention is actually the largest mission-sending agency in the world aside from the Roman Catholic Church. There's no other organization that sends out more missionaries than the Southern Baptist Convention. And we have the largest collection of seminaries in the world. There are 6 Southern Baptist seminaries, and they're all fairly large. They have a lot of students, and they train a lot of students for ministry. In a time and age, and this is important for you to know, in a time and age where most seminaries, so schools for training ministers, are closing their doors or struggling to stay open, and that's the vast majority of seminaries in the United States, our 6 seminaries that we help fund are healthy, and they're not shrinking, they're growing and they're expanding. So I would say the 2 main things that our money goes towards, although there are other things, the 2 main things are missions and then theological training in the seminaries. That's where our money goes. And that's where the bulk of our cooperative effort goes. So each year when we gather as the Southern Baptist Convention, the messengers gather together, the people sent to represent the churches, and we have to vote on things and make decisions. Now, some of those things are just electing officers every year. So that every year we have to elect a president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and a first vice president, and a second vice president, and a few other things. We elect people, and they serve voluntarily in those positions for a year. And most of the time, at least for offices like president, they'll get elected for an additional year and serve 2 years in a row, and then it'll be someone else. But every year there's an election held. And it's usually pastors that are elected to those positions, and like I said, they serve voluntarily. They don't get paid anything to do those jobs, and they work throughout the year to appoint people to various boards and other positions and keep things sort of moving and going so that things can be effective. Every year that we go, I will look outside, and I will usually see standing outside of whatever conference center or stadium we happen to be in, and there will be a handful of protesters standing out there. This year I counted 5 whole protesters holding signs. And then a lot of times I will then turn on the local news that night, and they will have the camera zoomed in on those few protesters and talk about all of the protesters that have come and are standing outside of the convention. And that really is kind of a picture of what happens online as well. So you probably don't keep up with any of it at all, and that's perfectly fine. But if like Andy mentioned, if you get your information about what happens when we gather together from Twitter or from any other social media source, you're probably getting a lot of distorted information. You're probably hearing things, and things are blown out of proportion, or people who weren't even there are telling you what happened when they don't really fully understand what was going on. So there are always some controversial things or things that have people kind of riled up or that are contentious sort of things every year, and we go through those things. Sometimes they're really big deals and they really matter, and sometimes they turn out in the end to not be as big of a deal as everybody thought they were. In the history of the Southern Baptist Convention, we have had years, even decades, where there have been very contentious battles that have been fought each year as the convention gathers. And so I think of particularly in the 80s and 90s, even leaning back into the 70s, when you had a major battle within the Southern Baptist Convention over whether or not the Bible was, in fact, inerrant. Should we receive the Bible as our statement of faith says, totally true and trustworthy, and without any errors in it at all? And you might think, well, of course, isn't that what all Christians believe? But in fact, the vast majority of denominations have moved away from that position, don't believe that anymore, and the Southern Baptist Convention in the middle of the 20th century was sort of following the same path as many Presbyterian denominations at the time, Methodist Church at the time, following that same path into theological liberalism, and teaching in our seminaries that the Bible was not necessarily totally true and trustworthy. It was not inerrant. And so in the beginning of the 70s through the 80s and 90s, there was what some call the conservative resurgence. Some people call it the fundamentalist takeover, depending on where you fell in that divide, where they were arguing over that very big substantive issue. And thankfully, those who believe that the Bible is inerrant won the day. And so now it feels light years removed from those sorts of debates. No longer is there any liberal theology being taught in our seminaries, which is not to say that I agree with every professor in every seminary over the things that they teach. I certainly don't. But I'm not worried about being taught the kinds of things at our seminaries that I was taught, for instance, in my undergraduate work, where Paul didn't write those letters, Jesus didn't do most of those miracles, and all those sorts of things. So we can look and understand, look at our convention and go, well, in the past we fought some pretty serious battles. And maybe at times the things spoken of on the news, it was as serious as it was portrayed. But now, the things that we are dealing with, the struggles that we have, and the discussions that we have and debates, tend to be over sort of lower tier issues. That doesn't mean they don't matter, but we're not fighting over what the gospel is. We're not fighting over whether or not the Bible is true, but we do have disagreements, and so therefore we have to come together and vote on things that sometimes are theological issues and sometimes they're not. And when they're theological issues, that means we have disagreements over what does the Bible actually say about X, Y, and Z. So when you have a group like the Southern Baptist Convention, a very large denomination, you know you're going to have a variety of opinions on a lot of things. And so you have to have some way of deciding, well, which things are the things that really matter? What are the things that we're going to unite around? And what borders and boundaries are we going to set to say that if you go outside of this, then you're not really one of us? Okay, it doesn't mean you're not a Christian, but if you go outside of these boundaries, then you don't really match up with what we say we believe. And so we have, as Southern Baptists, we have a statement of faith. Does anybody know what our statement of faith is called? Not here at our church, we have a different statement of faith, but for the Southern Baptist Convention, the statement of faith. Anybody know what it's called? Close. You know, Michael, I know. Yeah, the Baptist Faith and Message. And even more specifically, the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, because they updated it in the year 2000 in some significant ways to sort of close off and end that period where they were arguing and fussing and fighting over some more important issues. So the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And so that's both sets the center, right? So the things that we can agree on and come toward together, but it also sets some boundaries for us so that if people go outside of the boundaries set by that confession of faith, we would look and say, you're not really, and the language that we use technically is, you're no longer in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention if you are denying things or disagreeing with things that are in our statement of faith. And so if it were in a matter of essential doctrine, then we would go further than that. And we wouldn't simply say, you're no longer in friendly cooperation with us. We would say, well, you're outside of Christianity. Never mind denominations and things, you're outside of Christianity. But there are lesser issues, not like the Trinity, not like justification by faith alone. There are lesser issues, though, that if you take a certain position to where you disagree with our statement of faith, then you put yourself outside. And that happens quite a bit, actually. It happens often. Sometimes it happens with whole churches, where you have churches either taking on practices that contradict our statement of faith, or they're affirming teachings that contradict our statement of faith. The last couple of years, the last few years, the issue that has come to the fore has been the issue of women serving in churches as pastors. That has been the topic of conversation. Now, the Baptist Faith and Message is actually really clear on that. There's no debate over what our statement of faith has to say on that. Our statement of faith says that the role of elder or pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. So that our statement of faith is very clear on that, and it has been since the year 2000, since we updated the language in our statement of faith. And yet there have remained churches within the Southern Baptist Convention that have female pastors. And so at some point in time, somebody's going to call attention to that. Well, that's been sort of the issue over the last few years. So I don't know how many of you paid attention last year to things. You probably didn't, but maybe you did. We removed a few churches or declared them to be no longer in friendly cooperation with the convention last year. Anybody know what any of the... One of them was a very prominent church. Anybody know, Susan? Yeah, Saddleback Church in California, Rick Warren's church. Last year, we voted and said that they were no longer in friendly cooperation with the convention because Rick Warren and the other leaders of his church came out and very vocal about the fact that they disagreed with the Baptist faith and message, and that they felt that women could be pastors, and that they began appointing women as pastors, or had been already appointing women as pastors within their church. And then there were 2 or 3 other churches along with that church that we effectively removed from participation in the convention. And so in light of that, in light of the fact that our statement of faith says one thing and yet some churches are practicing another, also last year, someone proposed an amendment. His last name was Law, so it became known as the Law Amendment. You might have seen this in the newspaper. Anybody read about this? Nobody reads a newspaper. Did you see it online? Did you hear it in a blog? Okay. So the Law Amendment, as it became known, was really restating, essentially clarifying and applying what is already in our statement of faith about women serving as pastors in churches. But it was proposed as an amendment to our Constitution, because there's also a Constitution that kind of defines how we do things, right, and all the details. It's not mainly concerned with doctrine and theology so much as it is concerned with the organization of the convention and all those sorts of things. And so this amendment was proposed, added to the section, and this is how we could, to make it clear, if a church appoints someone or hires someone as a pastor, then they should be automatically declared to be no longer in friendly cooperation with. That was sort of what the amendment was about. But it's really hard to amend the Constitution, as it should be, right? It's really hard to get an amendment through for the United States Constitution. It's really hard to amend any Constitution. We have a Constitution as a church, and it takes a lot to amend the Constitution. It's not something you can do just offhand. So it takes a 2/3 vote 2 years in a row to change the Constitution in any way. So last year that someone proposed that amendment, we voted on it, and it easily got the 2/3. Well, from last year to this year, there were a lot of people who voted in favor of it who began to say, wait, why do we need this? What's the point of this? It's already in our statement of faith. Others who said, well, I agree that our statement of faith is clear, and I agree with our statement of faith, but what if the way that this is worded, there could be repercussions down the line for certain things? And so there was just enough kind of, not opposition to the idea of whether or not women could be pastors. Again, our statement of faith says it's restricted to men. That's called the complementarian position, and everybody was pretty much in agreement on that. That wasn't the issue. The issue was whether or not this amendment should be adopted. And it fell short a little bit, 61%. And you need 66% plus 1, basically, plus 1 vote in order for it to pass. So, some of the headlines that I read were things like Southern Baptist Convention rejects call for women to not be pastors. That's not really all that accurate. Our statement of faith still is very clear on that issue. The vote for this particular constitutional amendment simply failed in that for almost entirely practical reasons, not theological reasons. That was the thing that was discussed most often. That was the thing that was being tweeted about, misinformation being spread, I think, about. And that was the thing that, in between sessions when guys were getting coffee together or having lunch together or whatever, that was the thing that everybody wanted to talk about, what's going to happen with the law amendment. The general consensus that I got, though, after it did not pass, even among those who voted for it was, well, I'm a little disappointed, but that's okay. It's okay because this doesn't affect what we believe, what we say we believe, and the very fact that for 2 years in a row we have actually enforced our statement of faith by removing churches that were appointing women as pastors indicates that we're no longer in a place where we once were, where we said one thing on paper, but then in real life we turned a blind eye to things. We're clearly not there because we're holding people to the standards of the statement of faith. And I think that's an important thing. You may actually come from a background to where you're used to women serving as pastors, or you've been in churches where women have served as pastors, and that doesn't seem like a big deal to you at all. I do think that it matters. I think that the Bible is very clear on that issue. And when we do our membership class, it's one of the things that we talk about it because we're living in a culture that says there are no real differences between men and women. Even to the degree that the culture would say a man can become a woman and a woman can become a man, that the differences and distinctions are attempting to be erased. And that what I would point out is that there are differences between us. We're not the same. And those differences even impact the roles that we have, especially in our homes and in our churches. And that's not surprising that it would be those two areas. You have husbands and wives in homes, and they are going to have distinct roles. And the church is the household of God, and in some ways is going to reflect the family as God has set it up. So that the Bible very clearly says, Paul says, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. And so we take that to mean that women can't serve in the office of pastor or elder. We don't take it to mean that they can't teach anyone anytime, or that they can't teach the Bible, or that they can't lead in a number of ministries. We don't take it in that way at all. In fact, women are commanded to teach in the New Testament. Women are commanded to lead and disciple, especially other women. That without the ministry of women, the church is going to shrivel up and die. We know that. We're well aware of that. But we also know that there are differences between men and women. And those differences affect the roles that we can have in the home and in the church. So as Southern Baptists, we're one of the few denominations that are very clear on that issue, have been clear for a while, but are now becoming even more clear simply because we're enforcing the things that we've put on paper for a long time. And so that's really pretty important. That was the big issue this year. So you read about stuff and gender things or women as pastors going on, and debate, votes and debates happening. That's what happened at the convention. That there was this important vote, it didn't pass, but then at the same time we still this year removed another church for violating what that constitutional amendment was trying to strengthen. So on that issue, I don't think that we are compromised. I don't think we've moved any direction to the right or to the left or anywhere on that issue. We've stayed pretty much where we've been for a while and where we should be. There are other little things going on. We have things called resolutions that we vote on every year. So people can submit a resolution, a statement about some cultural issue or topic. And there's a committee that decides which one of those they're going to bring before the whole convention to vote on. And, sometimes those are really, really helpful. Sometimes they're not all that helpful. Sometimes they're important moral statements that we get an opportunity as messengers to vote on. Again, they don't grant anyone the authority to enforce anything. So, for instance, we voted this year on a resolution concerning fertility and in vitro fertilization. There was a resolution. You'd have to read it. It's too long for me to really tell you everything that it said. You'd read through it, and it was a moral statement about those issues. But the fact that that resolution was brought before the messengers and the messengers voted to pass it doesn't mean that any church is bound to respond to it or act in some way in accordance in any sort of way at all. Those resolutions are not like our statement of faith. They're not intended to be something that establishes a boundary or even a center about which we gather. They're just addressing immediate issues of the day as they sort of come up. And those sorts of things happen all the time. So you have those resolutions. They're not binding in any sort of way, but you may read in the newspaper that Southern Baptists voted to do this or that, when really it's just somebody brought forward a resolution, we voted on it, Maybe it passed, maybe it didn't. So, just to summarize, the convention, when we gather together, we're gathering together to make decisions that affect our ability to cooperate together for missions and for theological education. That's what we do. This year, nothing happened that's going to have a major long-term impact on the Southern Baptist Convention or the churches or the convention or the people in those churches. But that doesn't mean that what we gathered to do didn't matter. It just means that the things that we're dealing with now are not those big major issues that were being dealt with for a few decades there, and I'm grateful for that. So, got a couple of minutes for you guys to just ask any sort of questions related to these things. I know it's not terribly exciting to you, but it's helpful for me to give a report each year when I come back. So, any questions that you have about what we did this year, or even going back to what the convention is and how it operates? Anything at all? Susan? Our statement of faith does not say anything about whether men or women or both can serve as deacons. It doesn't say anything about that, and nobody's really said anything before. That would be in church by church. Yeah, I mean, it talks about the office of deacon and what it is, but it doesn't address that issue. Yeah. So that would be a church by church determination. That's a good question. Any other questions? Gloria? Almost every year there's a resolution on abortion, and it always passes every year. Now, they're not all the same. They deal with different aspects of divorce, of abortion, and the language changes from year to year. I'm not aware of any church or any leader of a church within the convention that supports abortion in any way. That's just not been an issue. Ever since sort of the move of the convention to take a stance on the inerrancy of the Bible and to say we're a conservative group, that's not an issue anymore. So you're not going to find anyone, you're not going to find any preachers in Southern Baptist life who are arguing for abortion or that it should be morally acceptable. You just wouldn't find it. But every year, there's some kind of resolution relating to abortion in some way. And I've never seen one not pass. So, any others? In terms of Calvinism? Well, so all of the founders of the Southern Baptist Convention were Calvinists. The Baptist Faith and Message, though, was not adopted until the 20th century. The earliest version, I want to say 1920-something. And by then, the Southern Baptist Convention was not mostly Calvinistic. By the mid-20th century, there were very few Calvinists in the convention. And it's gone through various stages. So what you can see in the Baptist Faith and Message is largely it doesn't take a stance on the issue of Calvinism. Now, there are exceptions to that. So, for instance, when you talk about the 5 points of Calvinism, you get to the last one, the P, perseverance of the saints. That's spelled out very clearly. So that's spelled out very clearly. There are statements that could be read in a very Calvinistic way in the statement of faith. So that, for instance, it talks about faith and repentance. I can't remember I would need to start quoting the whole article, and I don't want to do that. Faith and repentance as fruit or the product of the new birth, which sounds very Calvinistic, but I don't think it's intentionally sounding Calvinistic. It just came out that way. So it's not a Calvinistic statement of faith or an anti-Calvinistic statement of faith. It actually allows room for both, provided that we're agreeing on that one point, the last one, the perseverance. That's something you have to agree on. But the rest of them, there's plenty of room for movement. Yeah. Brooke? goodness. So there are 40-something thousand, I think, member churches. I think that's right. At one time, it was a lot more than that. It was like 60,000. But that was before, or that was in the midst of this conservative resurgence. And so I think that number has dwindled a bit. In terms of the number of missionaries that we're sending out, there have been times where we've sent out more. But I think, I want to say that we're seeing a growth in that area right now, but I would have to look at the exact numbers. One of probably the best parts of the convention every year, though, is actually the commissioning of new missionaries. And what they will do is they will bring, and we're going to have to stop probably after this, they have several new international missionaries come and they have a prepared sort of 30-second speech telling who they are and where they're going, and why they're going there, God's call on them. And it's a really great, moving time. Most of them, they can't even show their faces. They have to be behind a cloth because they're going to dangerous parts of the world, and they can't give their full names. It's really pretty cool. We get a chance to pray for them and acknowledge them. Of course, it's not all the new missionaries that we're sending out, but it's quite a few every year that come up and share. So, but I don't know the numbers. I'd have to look that up. So, maybe one more. Susan, were you going to ask something? I think he is. I haven't actually gone to look up sermons that he's preached on those issues, but just given he was a trustee at Southern Seminary. He does a lot of stuff with 9 marks. So my assumption would be that he probably is, but actually I've not gone on to listen to his sermons to find out. So. Oh shoot, now you ask me. Presley. Presley's his last name. First name is Clint. Thank you. I mean, I should know that. Okay, good. Clint. There it is, Clint Presley. So, there were 6 candidates for president this year. There's usually 2. Some years there's really only 1. So it was kind of different this year to have that many candidates. So, well, guys, thanks for dealing with me and being willing to listen. I'll go back again next year. We are allowed to send up to 12 messengers. So if you ever are interested in going and becoming a part and participating, just let me know, because it would be great to go up there and have somebody travel with me. So if anybody ever wants to go, we can take more people. And next year it's in Dallas, so next year it would actually be easier to do. No, it doesn't have to be men. No, messengers are just representatives of the churches. That's it. In fact, a lot of pastors go and their wives go, and their wives go as messengers as well. Yeah, right. Okay. All right, well, let me close this in prayer, and we'll be done for the night. Father, we thank you that as we're learning about spiritual discernment, that we're actually able to talk about things that we participate in with the Southern Baptist Convention, in which we're required to participate with discernment to determine whether or not, one, we fit within the boundaries of this organization, and whether or not it is worthy of our participation and our commitment to give toward. And then even as participants, every year we have to be discerning in the ways in which we as messengers, those who go as messengers, vote and the decisions that are made. And I pray that we would always have a desire to exercise discernment when opportunities arise. For each of us as individuals, part of that is deciding what church we're going to be a part of. And then as a church, that's deciding where's our money going to go, what are we going to support, and what are we going to be a part of. And so I pray that you would grant to us that we would have the wisdom and discernment that we need to be able to tell the difference between the good and the almost good, the true and the almost true. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.